This morning, I'm here to present the findings of investigations into 4 serious building and construction incidents which have occurred in the country between December 2025 and March of this year. These investigations were commissioned against the backdrop of a deeply concerning period for building safety in the country. On the 6th of May 2024, a multi-story residential building under construction in George collapsed, claiming 34 lives. That tragedy resulted in an extensive investigation through the Council for the Built Environment, which identified serious failures across different parts of the regulatory, professional and construction system. But George was not the last serious incident. On the 12th of December last year, a 5-story building under construction at the River Ranch Temple site in Redcliffe, Verulam, collapsed, killing 5 people and injuring 11. On the 28th of December, a 2-story portion of a residential structure in Doornkop in Soweto collapsed, killing 3 members of one family and injuring 3 others. On the 17th of February this year, temporary formwork failed at the Magnolia residential development in Sea Point, Cape Town, injuring 4 workers. And then on the 2nd of March, part of an industrial building under construction on Omonde, Johannesburg collapsed, killing 9 workers and injuring 6 people. Across the 4 investigations we are reporting on today, 17 people have lost their life and 24 people have been injured. These incidents demand more from government than simply expressing our sympathies and condolences. They require us to provide answers. They also require that we establish whether these incidents are isolated or whether they point towards broader weaknesses in the system responsible for ensuring that buildings in South Africa are safely planned, designed, approved, and constructed. Following the Omonde collapse in Johannesburg, I said that we needed to be frank in acknowledging that repeated building collapses point to deeper structural issues that must be urgently reviewed to improve building safety and construction oversight. I said then that as we work to turn South Africa into a construction site, it is critical that we do so in an environment where building construction can be trusted and the loss of life avoided. In fact, I said that we need to move to a zero tolerance for death and injury in construction. The investigations we are presenting today provide important evidence with which to assess this concern. I therefore directed the Council for the Built Environment to undertake technical, governance and regulatory investigations into these incidents. The investigations did not look only at the physical point at which a structure failed. They examined the technical circumstances surrounding each incident. They examined whether the appropriate building approvals and construction permits were in place, and they consider whether suitably registered and competent building environment professionals have been appointed. They also consider whether construction was being properly supervised and inspected. And they also examined whether municipalities, regulators, and others responsible were able to identify and intervene where construction was unsafe or unlawful. The first important conclusion is that these 4 incidents were not the same. Each occurred in different circumstances and had different immediate causes. We should therefore not present every collapse as evidence of precisely the same failure. In particular, the Magnolia incident is materially different from the fatal incidents in Redcliffe, Doornkop, and Omonde. But when the investigations are considered together, they identify reoccurring weaknesses across parts of the built environment system which now require urgent attention. Let me deal briefly with each incident. With regards to Redcliffe in Verulam, the first investigation concerns the collapse in eThekwini. The site formed part of the River Ranch Temple complex in Verulam that I visited a day or so after the tragedy. A temple had already been constructed on the property, and a 5-story reinforced concrete administrative and office building was subsequently erected immediately adjacent to it. At approximately 11:55 on the 12th of December 2025, while concrete was being poured on the upper levels, the building collapsed. 5 people died and 11 were injured. The investigation could not conclusively determine a single technical cause because critical information did either not exist or could not be obtained. No complete structural drawings could be located, no responsible construction team could be identified either, and no built environment professional responsible for the design and supervision of the 5-story building could be positively identified. The investigators did identify several possible technical contributors, including concerns about reinforcement, structural configuration, foundations, concrete, and temporary support. But the clearest findings relate to the regulatory environment in which the building was being constructed. The 5-story building had no approved plans. There was no construction work permit, and the Department of Employment and Labour had not been notified that construction had been commenced. And no building environment professionals had been appointed to provide the professional services required for a project of this nature. This meant that a substantial multi-story building was effectively able to rise and be constructed outside of the formal regulatory system. Because the necessary approvals had not been obtained, the project also did not pass through the ordinary systems of regulatory inspection and oversight. The investigators described Redcliffe as a case of ignoring the law, to quote them. That is the central lesson from this incident. A building of this scale should never have been capable of progressing so far without the necessary approvals, professional oversight, and regulatory visibility. And it calls into question how it got that far without intervention. With regards to Doornkorp in Soweto, these circumstances were very different. The collapse occurred at approximately 3 a.m. on the 28th of December 2025, following heavy rainfall in Johannesburg. Part of a 2-story residential structure in Tulani, Extension 2, collapsed, killing a 60-year-old woman, her 24-year-old daughter, and her 1-year-old granddaughter. 3 other occupants were injured. The investigation established that the property was situated on high-risk dolomitic land. Importantly, this danger was already known at the time. A decision had been taken in the late 1990s to relocate residents from the property because of the dolomite risk. Compensation was paid, the property was vacated, and demolition occurred. However, part of the original building remained standing. Years later, another family moved into the abandoned structure. The investigation concludes that the most probable cause of the eventual collapse was a shallow sinkhole or doline beneath the building, which resulted in the loss of foundational support. But there is a wider governance finding. Government had already identified this land as unsafe, yet the risk was not managed through to its conclusion. The investigation also found weaknesses in Johannesburg's broader management of dolomitic land. These include concerns about whether the required dedicated dolomite risk management capacity had been established, weaknesses in the system used to manage known dolomite risks, shortcomings in preventing unlawful occupation of particularly high-risk land, and inadequate public awareness and hazard reporting mechanisms. The report also points to the presence of other occupied properties within areas previously considered unsafe. Doornkorp therefore raises a broader concern extending beyond a single house. And the lesson is quite simple. Identifying a danger is not enough. Once government knows that land or a structure poses a serious risk to life, that risk has to be actively managed until it is resolved. The investigators described Doornkorp to, quote, a case of not enforcing the law. With regards to Magnolia in Sea Point, this incident requires an important distinction. Magnolia is a large residential development under construction on Main Road in Sea Point. On the 17th of February this year, approximately 40 square meters of temporary formwork at level 3 became unstable and failed. There were approximately 140 workers on the site at the time. Four workers were injured, 2 moderately and 2 with minor injuries. The investigation makes clear that this was not the collapse of the permanent structural elements of the building. It was a failure of temporary works during construction. The immediate cause was the premature loading of an incomplete and uninspected temporary works structure. The affected deck had not yet achieved the structural stability required by the design. It had also not been formally inspected and had not been approved for loading. Nevertheless, material was placed onto it without those conditions being met. Unlike Redcliffe and Ormonde, however, the investigation found that the development had complied with the applicable planning requirements and that the necessary professionals had been appointed. A professional health and safety agent was in place, regular safety audits had occurred, and that the incident was investigated internally. The relevant regulatory authorities were also notified, and corrective measures were implemented before any further work continued. Those corrective measures included reassessing temporary works, strengthening inspection and handover requirements before loading, reinforcing safety procedures with workers and contractors, and changing aspects of the system. That does not mean that does not make the incident insignificant. 4 people were obviously injured, but it demonstrates why we must distinguish between these cases. Magnolia shows that even where the regulatory and professional framework is in place, construction stage controls have to operate properly every day. Compliance cannot simply exist in documentation, and every safety control has to operate at the point where work is actually being performed. With regards to Ormonde in Johannesburg, this is the 4th investigation. The building was under construction in Ormonde Extension 50. On the 2nd of March of 2026, while concrete topping was being placed on suspended floors, part of the structure collapsed onto workers below. 9 workers died and 6 were injured. The technical findings are extremely serious. Engineers inspecting the surviving structure identified significant deficiencies in the structural steelwork supporting the suspended floors. The investigation raises concerns about connection details, the selection of structural members, and the overall structural configuration. The steelwork failed while concrete topping was being placed. The investigators concluded that the beams and columns supporting the effective slabs effectively had no capacity to carry the additional live load being applied during this construction operation. Critical construction drawings, design information, and details of structural members requested during the investigation were also not provided, limiting the ability of investigators to verify the design against the applicable standards. The regulatory findings are equally concerning. No application for building approval had been submitted to the City of Johannesburg before the collapse. An application was only submitted after the incident. So after the building collapsed, they then decided to submit an application. The investigation also identified serious concerns about the professional engineering arrangements associated with the development. These included the involvement of an engineer who had been previously deregistered by the Engineering Council of South Africa, as well as questions regarding the competence and role of another registered professional subsequently reflected in statutory documentation. These professional matters have been recommended for further investigation to the Engineering Council of South Africa. The investigation also raises concerns about whether the necessary construction work permit and appropriate health and safety appointments were in place. The investigators describe Omonde as, I quote, a disaster waiting to happen. That is a severe conclusion, ladies and gentlemen. But the technical, regulatory, and professional evidence contained in the report explains why the investigators reached that conclusion. So what do these four separate investigations tell us? When these four cases are considered together, several broader findings become clear. The first is that South Africa does not suffer from a complete absence of legislation governing construction. There is already an existing regulatory framework dealing with planning, building standards, occupational health and safety, professional regulation, municipal approvals, and construction. The principal problem, as we see it, and identified by these investigations, is inconsistent implementation, inadequate oversight, weak enforcement, and non-compliance. At the same time, the report identifies areas in which the regulatory framework itself requires modernization and strengthening. And that distinction is important. We cannot respond to every failure simply by producing another rule. But neither can we ignore areas where existing legislation has become outdated, where penalties no longer provide a meaningful deterrent, or where responsibilities need to be clarified. The second major finding is that significant unlawful construction can remain outside the formal regulatory system. Redcliffe and Omonde are the clearest examples of that. In both cases, substantial construction had progressed without prior building approval. The investigations also raised concerns about the wider practice of construction proceeding first and approval being sought afterwards, and that is completely unacceptable. Building approval is not unnecessary red tape. It is a public safety control. The purpose of obtaining approval before construction is precisely to allow the relevant authority to consider whether what is proposed complies with the law before people are exposed to risk. A system in which substantial construction can proceed and only afterwards be regularized fundamentally weakens that protection and puts people at risk. The third finding concerns what happens after approval has been granted and construction commences. The reports identify an excessive regulatory focus on the initial building plan approval stage. Building control cannot stop when a plan receives a stamp of approval. Authorities need visibility over what happens during construction. They need to know when construction has commenced, they need to know whether what is being built corresponds with what is approved, and they need to know who has accepted professional responsibility. And there must be functional systems for inspection, certification, and ultimately occupational certificates. The fourth finding relates to municipal capacity and capability. Municipalities are at the front line of building regulation. The investigations raise concerns about shortages of suitably qualified building control professionals, limited inspection capacity, and in some cases there is none, and the ability of municipalities to identify construction which has never entered the approval system to begin with. We should not generalize across every municipality. The findings themselves demonstrate materially different circumstances between the municipalities involved. But where capacity constraints exist, they directly affect the ability of the government to protect the public. The reports therefore recommend that the affected municipalities assess and strengthen their building control capacity and enforcement systems. They also raise innovative proposals for improving early detection of major construction activity, including better ward-level reporting and potentially mechanisms through which significant orders of concrete or precast slabs should alert building control authorities to large construction projects taking place within their jurisdiction. The fifth major issue is professional competence and accountability. Professional registration cannot simply mean that someone's name appears on a form. The person accepting responsibility for a structural system must have the actual competence, knowledge, training, and experience required for that particular work. The investigations raised concerns about inadequate supervision, failure to discharge statutory responsibilities, and weaknesses in verifying whether people accepting responsibility for specialized or high-risk work have the required competence to begin with. Where the report recommends further investigation by professional councils, those investigations must now take place. The sixth finding is that our regulators do not share enough information with one another. A municipality may know whether building plans have been approved. The Department of Employment and Labour may hold information about construction notification or construction permits. The NHBRC may know whether a residential development has been enrolled. And professional councils know who is registered and whether a person's registration is in good standing. These are different pieces of information about the same construction project, and if they remain locked in separate systems, warning signs can be missed. The reports therefore recommend improved information sharing between municipalities, the Department of Employment and Labour, the NHBRC, professional councils, and other regulators. The seventh finding concerns consequence management. Where owners, developers, contractors, or professionals deliberately ignore statutory requirements, penalties must provide a real deterrent. The reports recommend that sanctions for violations of planning and construction requirements must be strengthened. They specifically raise the need for far stronger consequences where non-compliance contributes to death or serious injury. They also recommend stronger consequences for ignoring stop work notices, and people cannot regard compliance with building legislation as optional because the financial consequences of breaking the law are less significant than the financial benefits of continuing the construction. That balance must change. Taken together, these are not four isolated lessons. They reinforce weaknesses that government has now seen emerge across successive structural incidents. So what is the link then to the George issue that we have previously dealt with? These findings also reinforce a number of lessons identified following the George building collapse. The circumstances of George, Redcliffe, Doornkorp, Magnolia, and Ormonde are not identical, but reoccurring issues are evident. These include the need for stronger professional accountability, improved information sharing, greater visibility of construction activity, better systems for reporting structural incidents, improved verification of professional competence, and a modernization of our regulatory framework. One of the important recommendations emerging from these investigations is that government needs to become better at detecting risks before tragedy occurs. That has to be our objective. As I've said before, we must be frank in acknowledging that repeated collapses point to deeper structural issues that must be urgently reviewed to improve building safety and construction oversight. As we work to turn South Africa into a construction site, it's critical that we do so in an environment where building construction can be trusted and the loss of life avoided. Increasing the scale and scale of construction cannot come at the expense of safety. In fact, the more that we build, the more important effective building control, competent professionals, proper construction management, and strong enforcement become. So, what happens next? The investigations presented today cannot simply conclude with the publications of findings. The recommendations now need to be considered and acted upon by the institutions that are responsible for them. I've directed the Council for the Built Environment to formally share the relevant findings and recommendations arising from these investigations with the respective municipalities and other affected stakeholders, and to engage them directly on the findings and proposed interventions. This approach ensures that the release of the findings is led by the Minister on behalf of government, while also demonstrating that the next phase will be undertaken collaboratively with the affected municipalities and stakeholders. Where a finding requires investigation by professional counsel, it will be referred to so. Where recommendations concern municipal building control, risk management systems, or enforcement, that municipality must act. And where recommendations require action by national government or changes to the regulatory framework, those recommendations should be considered by the responsible institutions, including myself. Where information arising from these investigations may be relevant for possible criminal conduct, it is and will be made available to the appropriate law enforcement authorities. It's important, however, that we respect due process. These reports identify technical, regulatory, governance, and professional failures. They do not determine criminal or civil liability. That responsibility ultimately rests with the appropriate investigative authorities, professional disciplinary processes, and the courts. We must therefore avoid prejudging those processes. I also want to make it clear that the 4 reports being discussed today do not represent the end of our work in relation to recent structural incidents. Following the collapse of a retaining wall at the Nazareth Baptist Church, also known as the Shembe Church, at Ebuhleni in Inanda in July, the CBE was requested to support government's response through a technical and public protection intervention. The CBE is working with the Shembe Church leadership to coordinate the necessary multidisciplinary professional expertise to assess their sites. Importantly, the intervention will seek to establish and identify the technical and other factors that contributed to that collapse that injured a number of people. The work will therefore include the necessary technical and geotechnical assessments, engineering investigations, and design work to understand the causes of that failure and to develop a safe, technical, and implementation-ready solution for the affected area and their continued construction. This intervention is still early, and it's even innovative by working with such a large organization like that, which does construction across the country. Further information on the Ebuhleni intervention will be communicated as the technical work progresses. Ladies and gentlemen, the purpose of the investigations we are presenting today was to establish what happened and, importantly, what these incidents tell us about the system responsible for protecting you, the public. The answer is not that every construction site in South Africa is unsafe, nor is the answer that every municipality, regulator, or built environment professional a failure. The evidence does not support either conclusion. The answer is that there are identified weaknesses in our system, which in some cases have allowed dangerous or unlawful construction to proceed, reduced the ability of local authorities to intervene, weakened professional accountability, and left known risks inadequately managed. At Magnolia, the evidence also shows that even within an otherwise compliant project, a failure to apply a critical construction safety control can result in a serious incident. And those distinctions do matter. But so does the common responsibility arising from all of our investigations. Where there are gaps, we must close them, and where enforcement is weak, we must strengthen them. Where municipalities require stronger capacity, that must be addressed. And where government already knows that there's a serious risk, the risk cannot be left unresolved. 17 people died in 4 incidents before we meet here today. That number should remain at the center of our response. The families who lost loved ones deserve to know what happened and why it happened. The workers who enter construction sites across South Africa every morning deserve a system which does everything reasonably possible to keep them safe. And South Africans deserve to know that when a building is erected in their community, the law has been followed, competent people have designed and supervised it, and the authorities responsible for protecting the public are able to do their jobs. If we're serious about turning South Africa into a construction site, then we should be equally serious about ensuring that South Africa becomes a safe construction site. That is the responsibility these findings now place before us,